Carol.
No, we can't use that word in publications anymore.
So what do we use instead?
Healthy older people.
Healthy older people. Okay, so welcome to you, Carol, and we look forward to your presentation this morning. Carol's going to speak to us for about half an hour, and there'll be time for questions. So if you make yourself familiar with the question and answer box at the bottom, and ask any questions as we go through today, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll ask Carol those questions at the end. So kia ora to you, Carol.
Oh, kia ora, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you about improving nutrition to support healthy aging. I think, Alison, that is correct. I sort of have a real interest in this area. I suppose just experiencing it for myself when my mother developed dementia and the terrible malnutrition I saw in dementia care, but also in sort of realising that really the ageing population is becoming a significant proportion of our population. And I want to take you through some slides just to illustrate that a bit more. So I've just provided a little outline here. So I just want to take you through some slides that show that older people are growing at a faster rate than younger people. So we're going to have proportionally more older people and proportionally fewer younger people, which is important because we might not have the taxpayer income to support all the demands for health costs of the increasing proportion of older people. Then we'll look at why are older people nutritionally vulnerable? Why is it that we have to do something special for older people? Why do we have different food and nutrition guidelines for older people, and what's the evidence? What are older people living at home eating or missing out on? We have done some work in the community to understand that. Why are older people malnourished or at high risk of malnutrition? And what are the risk factors? And then we'll look at what the challenges are for older people's nutrition in the next 5-10 years or so.
Carol, before you start, could you please just position yourself a bit closer to the microphone?
Yep. Okay, I've just got to get my laptop a bit closer to me. How's that?
That sounds great. That's better. Thank you.
Okay.
Carol, you're on mute now. Can you take yourself off mute?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just moving the taskbar at the top so I could see my chart. So it's just really showing the proportion of older people growing at a faster rate than younger people. So this is the rate of growth down here in the middle of the slide. This is the numbers of population over on the left axis, and over here the age of people. And here we go from 2015, another 10 years, 25 to 2035. So you can see that the slope in terms of the older people is growing faster, but you can see too that really for people aged 0 to 24 years, there's only barely any growth at all over that 20-year period, and not much different, although there is an increasing slope, 14% for those aged 25 to 44. But then when you get to the over 65s, you can see there's a 31% rate of growth, 57% for those aged 75 to 85, and then the 90 plus group is growing at a faster rate too. So we're all living longer, but proportionately there are fewer younger people, and we have to think about what that means. So one of the ways that we can look at that is provided in a book provided by Paul Spoonley. I don't know whether you know Paul Spoonley, but he's quite a well-known demographer. He's at Massey University, and he's just written this book, which I've purchased, called The New Zealand, Facing Demographic Disruption. And he's talking about this demographic disruption in terms of the growth of older people and the relatively fewer number of younger people to support older people. So currently, in terms of the over 65s, they outnumber those under the age of 15. They are the healthiest ever to reach 65. And I think the first baby boomers turned 65 in about 2012. So we are getting the effect of the baby boomer growth. There are obviously declines in death rates because we're healthier, we're living longer. The total fertility rate has significantly dropped and it's below replacement. And we have these falling numbers in younger age groups. So I think it's just something that we need to sort of think about in terms of how we address these issues. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to look at the top of my slide without muting myself. So in terms of that last chart, it is actually the 85 plus group that is the fastest growing population segment in New Zealand. And we don't often think about that, but indeed, people are living longer, a lot of staying in their homes for a lot longer, which is great. But I guess they are a more vulnerable group. And we do know that in terms of the over 85s, they use about 3 times the healthcare resources compared to other age groups. They have the highest rate of preventable hospital admissions, and almost half currently use residential care, meaning that they've lost their independence. They've had a needs assessment to show that they need care in residence. And as you know, our aging in place strategy is all about trying to keep people living in their own homes for longer. And there is a lot of care support services to facilitate that. Okay, so then the next point comes up that we know that older people are nutritionally vulnerable, and we know that there's lots and lots of reasons for that. Typically, there is body composition change with age. It's not always inevitable, and some people have a faster rate of change in body composition than others. In other words, they lose a lot of lean mass or muscle mass and bone, and have a proportionally higher fat mass. But also, there's a whole lot of other things that conspire against us with aging, to do with changes in physiology, with appetite regulation, with sensory, hearing and eyesight changes, dentition. Our oral health is a real problem in older people, and thinking about younger people at the moment and their oral health, that is a frightening prospect, isn't it? To think what is their dentition going to be like as they get older. In fact, I was speaking with Professor Murray Thompson recently at the University of Otago, and I was quite sort of frightened with the fact that he said that things are so dire in dementia care that he really wonders whether dementia patients with oral health problems would be much better off with dentures. Because I think we have so many residents of dementia care who are in pain with their oral health. And I think also that we have to think about oral health in a multidisciplinary kind of a way. And I've just joined this group in Australia called Cohort, which is something to do with care of oral health, which is trying to encourage all health disciplines to think about oral health, not just dental. So I think in nutrition we have to think about that too. And there's some very simple ways of understanding about older people's oral health, and even just tooth count. Sometimes you can see people have got missing teeth, can't you? Or you can ask people how many teeth they might have lost. But it's a really key issue. Of course, there's gastrointestinal changes, and then there's all the social, psychological changes as well, like losing a spouse, depression tends to be higher, particularly amongst those who live alone. And that impacts motivation and opportunity to procure food, to prepare it, to cook it and eat it. And this ultimately results in perhaps a lot of older people who fall into this category of eating too little food. And that's really the #1 problem for a lot of older people. They're just eating too little food and not enough variety. And that tends to be the key cause of weight loss, particularly muscle loss. And we know that this increases the risk of sarcopenia, which is a logarithm about losing muscle mass, but also muscle strength and functional ability. And that now is an internationally classified disease. So we need to be looking out for sarcopenia. Increased risk of osteoporosis, falls and fractures, and chronic disease risk. And this is really just showing the cross section of a thigh, of the muscle of an average healthy adult on the left, showing the bone in the middle, the fatty adipose tissue in the white here, and the muscle in the thigh being quite gregarious, quite large. Whereas after sarcopenia, the thigh circumference doesn't change, the diameter doesn't change, but you can see the composition changes, and this is the problem. And it's thought that even though there's less muscle, some of the muscle myofibrils might have fatty infiltration too, weakening the muscle. So this is why we really have to attend to people as they get older so that we don't actually have the sarcopenia impeding their functional ability. And just to quickly show a lot of risk factors for sarcopenia occurring, obviously it's multifactorial. It's to do with being sedentary, being immobilized, particularly if people have an extended time in hospital, being inactive, but also from a dietary point of view, having a protein imbalance from increased protein breakdown and decreased protein synthesis. But also there's all these anabolic hormones that aren't working as well, adding to the picture, and changing metabolism and changing requirements. And we know that in terms of maintaining independence throughout life, it's really important that we maintain muscle mass and strength as here in the y-axis with age, and that there is a disability threshold. So in early life, we tend to have a good amount of muscle mass and strength. And that does slowly decline in adult life, but the less it declines, the better. And in older adults, we want to keep it above this disability threshold, where there's insufficient muscle strength and functional ability. So loss of function means people have developed a disability and they can't maintain their function and independence. And that's really key for us to understand when we're looking after the health of older people. So in terms of what we are eating, I just want to show you some work that we did in the LILAC study, Life and Living to Advanced Age in New Zealand, which was a cohort study which started in 2010, in which 900 older people over the age of 85 for non-Māori, over the age of 75 for Māori were engaged from the Bay of Plenty and Lakes District, the district health boards. And so everyone was invited. And so it's a very representative sample, and it's the only study in the world with a large cohort of Indigenous people. So it's attracted quite a lot of funding from the Health Research Council and the Ministry of Health. But anyway, in the follow-up survey in 2011, we did a detailed dietary assessment where we actually trained very rigorously our nurses to do a 2x2 24-hour recall. And so we were able to assess the diet pretty comprehensively. And I know that we've got data in the Adult Nutrition Survey way back 2008, 2009, but everybody over the age of 71 was aggregated in that study, and we really haven't got any recent data about older people's nutrition since that time. Anyway, I just wanted to point out to you that the carbohydrate, protein, and fat intakes as a proportion of energy, the mean energy intake for Maori was 1,500 calories and slightly more for non-Maori. So, you know, around the 1,500–1,600 mark. And of that, 45% of it came from carbohydrate. So probably at the lower end of the average macronutrient distribution range of 45 to 65. 15–16% came from protein, which is again at the lower end of the average macronutrient distribution range, 15 to 25. And then a surprising large amount of the energy came from fat, you know, 37–38% above the average macronutrient range. So that's something new for us. We didn't really realize that protein intake was so minimal, carbohydrate relatively minimal, but fat proportionally higher than the distribution range. However, remember that our nutrient reference values are based on work from younger adults, and I don't think we really know in this age group what the desirable average macronutrient distribution range might be. And we also assessed all these vitamins and minerals, and we found that overall the key micronutrients that were below the nutrient reference values, or the EAR, were calcium. We know that the food sources of calcium were quite low, magnesium, and selenium. And there were some changes in others too, which differed by gender and ethnicity, for things like zinc and B12 and iron and so forth. But generally, selenium, calcium, magnesium were the nutrients that were less than the EAR. And we were able to describe the food sources of intake. So this is here is food sources contributing to greater than 75% of protein intake. And the top one is for Maori men, then Maori women on the right, then non-Maori men on the left bottom, and non-Maori women on the right bottom here. So just showing that the food sources are slightly different. I don't know whether you remember from the 2008-09 survey that bread was the largest contributor to protein in the New Zealand diet. So this is slightly different. It was for Maori men, fish and seafood and beef and veal were equal. And I think this raises the importance of understanding traditional foods, that in that Bay of Plenty area, and particularly Whakatane, Potiki, Te Kaha, there is quite a reliance on seafood, and communities like Te Kaha, a lot of whānau provided older people with fish and seafood. So that became a quite important food for men. For Maori women, it was very different. Most of their protein came from bread, then milk, and then beef and veal. For non-Maori men, it was beef and veal, then bread, milk, poultry. And for non-Maori women, it was milk as the largest contributor, followed by bread, beef and veal. So we didn't kind of know that from the Adult Nutrition Survey, but it really helps us to understand where protein is coming from. And I don't know whether you've seen, but in the latest position statement from the Australian New Zealand Geriatric Association, I think, Geriatric Association, there are guidelines to encourage older people to have sufficient protein evenly spread across the day. And there's very good evidence now that if we present protein evenly across the day at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, in this fashion here in this chart, we optimize protein synthesis. Whereas typically we think that older people have relatively little protein at breakfast, then lunch, and most of their protein at dinner. But if we could optimize protein synthesis by changing this, so it's really good to see in the position statement that we should be encouraging older people to have equal amounts of protein across meals. And when you think about it, I think older people used to often have a cooked breakfast, an egg maybe, but maybe that's not so kind of fashionable anymore. But maybe we should be thinking about that in terms of improving protein intake. And I just want to show you this Anishka Ram, who is a student that worked with me. She did analysis of protein intake and determinants in the LILAC study. And she was able to look at the protein distribution across meals here for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I'll just show you in the next slide what she found. So obviously this differed by gender and by ethnicity. So we've got here Maori women, non-Maori women, and Maori men and non-Maori men. So it differs a little, but I'll just show you in the next slide what it kind of looked like. First of all, she found that protein intake was low compared to the estimated average requirement in a third of women and a third of men. And that's not surprising since they just met that 15% average macronutrient distribution range from energy. So protein intake was generally low. And certainly we didn't see an even distribution across meal. Protein in terms of grams per meal was lowered at breakfast, then lunch, and then dinner. And so this is for women here, first of all in the bracket, 10 grams, and then men, 13 grams. 14 for women, nearly 18 for men, 23 for women, and 34 for men. So you would expect that men to be eating more protein. But you can see that we haven't got an optimized protein distribution. I think that's something we have to think about, how we can improve that. In terms of other determinants, women, of course, had less protein, but also people with depressive symptoms had less protein. And what we found was the independent predictor of having an adequate protein intake was participants who had their own teeth or partial dentures, as opposed to full dentures or no teeth. So oral health predicted adequate protein intake. And that was something that we didn't expect it to be the independent predictor. And that's why I've been joining this cohort group and trying to understand a bit more about oral health, because I think that it means that perhaps people who don't have good dentition might find some protein foods really quite hard to chew. And of course it gets quite convoluted because we know that a lot of people have dysphagia and swallowing difficulty that comes from being a bit sarcopenic, having lower muscle mass and strength as well. And we actually had some another analysis done from Fiona Baguette when she worked with me. Fiona's now, of course, you know, very much part of the dietetic workforce. But she did an analysis from the 24-hour records and was able to show that Maori with lower protein intakes were more likely to be hospitalized due to infection than those who had an adequate protein intake. So we know there are health outcomes as a result of having insufficient protein. So that's understanding about what they eat. And we do know that older people too are at risk of malnutrition. So we actually, in the baseline assessment, Lilacs undertook a screen using the Canadian screen tool. And this is just showing you the area that was involved in Lilacs New Zealand, you know, all right throughout this area. So we were able to recruit in 2010 420 Maori aged 80 to 90 and 516 non-Maori at 85. And they have been visited every year until they died. And so we're looking at some of the 10-year outcomes now, and I'm doing some work at the moment to look at that. So we did publish shortly after the baseline assessment, the risk of malnutrition, and using the validated Canadian screen tool, which stands for Seniors in the Community Risk Evaluation for Eating and Nutrition, we showed that half of Maori, 49%, and 38% of non-Maori were at high nutrition risk. And there were some risk factors too. For Maori, it was being at a younger age, having a lower education, living alone, and with depressive symptoms. For non-Maori, it was associated with being female, living alone, having a lower physical health-related quality of life, and depressive symptoms as well. So that was quite a large group to be able to provide that evidence from. Similarly, we have looked at community living older people in the Massey University Health Work and Retirement Study, which is a very large cohort of people who receive a postal questionnaire. So in 2014, we added the screen tool, and we used a validated postal form as they had done in Canada. And we found of 2,900 community living older people aged 49 to 87 years, half of Maori, 51%, and 33% of Maori were at risk of malnutrition. So very similar, I guess, in terms of what we've seen in the Lilac study. And from that analysis, we were able to determine independent risk factors, and they were for both Maori and non-Maori, not living with a partner, living alone, rating general health as fair as opposed to good. And in addition, for non-Maori, but not for Maori, the risk factors were having a lower life satisfaction, having an increased number of health conditions, and increased emotional loneliness scores. So I think that's interesting that we didn't see that among Maori, and I think it's to do with the whānau and wider hapu and iwi might be more supportive. There's a lot more intergenerational living and maybe not so much emotional loneliness. And health conditions really did affect the ability of older non-Maori to maybe prepare and cook and eat food, and having a lower life satisfaction as well. But certainly living alone is a very, very well known risk factor. So moving ahead from that, that's a lot in a small snapshot, but what might be the challenges? How can we improve older people's nutrition in the next 5 years? Well, number one, we need to make sure they're eating enough nutrient-rich foods. And that means, I guess, you know, we've got in our guidelines for healthy older people, take opportunities to eat meal with others. And we really can't sort of emphasize that enough. You know, Meals on Wheels is a nice way of providing food, but we know that often it's just left on the kitchen bench. What is enjoyed more is the interaction when somebody comes to the door to deliver the meal, the social interaction. That we know that eating is facilitated by companionship. So the best thing that people can do is share a meal with somebody. We know that malnourished older people may lose weight, get tired, they lose their muscle strength, and that's a prime risk factor for falls and disability. And one of the things that we do know, that eating a healthy dietary pattern can prevent from chronic disease like cardiovascular health, cognitive decline, and dementia. I'll talk about that a bit more, but I just wanted to show you this slide looking at hazards of mortality per point change in BMI. So here's the relative hazard of mortality on this scale here, and here's BMI here. But can you see that in terms of the hazard of mortality, people with a BMI of 30 are the most protected. So we now know that a BMI under 23 is a risk factor for older people. And when we write up our papers now, we actually do analysis to show what proportion of people have got a BMI under 23, because that's considered to be at risk. And we know that in terms of the traditional overweight BMI score of 25 to 30, that's considered a healthy kind of a range for older people. Of course, it changes as people get very obese, but this does confirm existing literature that older people fare better with a higher BMI, particularly in advanced stage. And reduction in mortality risk, of course, can be accentuated in dementia, where malnutrition is a common contributor. And we know that dementia is on a rising trajectory. And one of the things that Paul Spooner says in his book is that we're not planning for it. We haven't planned for the enormous rise in number of older people with dementia. And yeah, I just wanted to show this position paper from the Geriatric Medicine Association. Their position paper is entitled Undernutrition in the Older Person. This was published in 2017, which suggests screening. It's important that older people are screened and assessed for undernutrition and sarcopenia. And that really should happen, you know, at primary care level. And that older people will have high daily protein requirements. Protein intake should be spread equally across 3 main meals. Now, I show this because we can't think about individual foods. We can only think about dietary patterns, which present a broader picture, more predictive of disease risk like dementia and cognitive decline and chronic disease risk. And when I prepared a lecture for Dementia New Zealand recently, I covered a lot of material showing how the Mediterranean diet pattern seems to be very protective from cognitive decline and dementia. And we all know what that looks like, but it's really important we keep that top of mind, that if we want to slow the rate of cognitive decline and dementia risk, we need to think about a plant-based diet. And here's this nice slide showing the Mediterranean diet here on the left, and just the inverse of the typical Western diet. It's a bit of a cynical sort of a slide, but anyway, it does highlight the point, doesn't it, that we really do need to have lots of fruits and vegetables. And I was quite surprised about the low fruit and vegetable intake amongst a lot of older people. And there's a lot of evidence for this from cohort studies. Here's must have been a systematic review or meta-analysis of 10 cohort studies analysis 35,000 participants, where showing that adherence to a Mediterranean style of eating could reduce cognitive decline. And there's various other randomized controlled trials too, showing the same protective effects of Mediterranean style of eating. And there's a lot of underlying mechanisms. And I guess it's to do with having, this high fruit and vegetable intake, rich in polyphenols and antioxidants, protecting the brain from oxidative stress and inflammation, and also increasing the diversity of the microbiota, which is a potential contributor to chronic inflammation when the diversity is in decline. And we know that there is a cardioprotective effect too from eating this style of food. And of course, a lot of dementia is vascular related. The Heart Foundation's got some great resources about a healthy Mediterranean diet pattern. It does really point out that people who eat a healthier diet also tend to lead a healthier lifestyle, so that it can explain some of the associations, but not all. And finally, thinking about where our centenarians live in the world and how they live, I think is another reminder to us all about healthy eating. So we know that there are certain lifestyle characteristics associated with the Blue Zone countries and Japan, Greece, Sardinia, and Costa Rica, and California, where there's a large proportion of centenarians. And these are the typical characteristics. So it does include diet. It includes eating the smallest meal in the early evening, a plant-based diet, eating meat on average about 5 times a month, drinking 1 to 2 glasses a day with friends and with food. Some of the characteristics include belonging to a faith-based community, keeping aging parents nearby or in the home, or being lucky enough to be born into social circles that support healthy behaviours. So it's not all about diet, but it's about, things like reducing stress, having a sense of purpose. It's thought to give you an increased life expectancy of another 7 years. And living in an environment where you're constantly nudged into moving without thinking about it. So a lot of these Blue Zone older people are doing things like collecting, procuring food, which gives them a lot of activity without even thinking about it. So I've taken that through quite quickly, Alison. So I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Fabulous overview. Thank you, Carol. There's a number of people that have thanked you on the question and answers. So that's been a great overview. Just taking us back to one of the first points you made was having higher than expected fat intakes. Was there a breakdown of the type of fat that was? Is that a Mediterranean type of diet fat, or is that more of a typical Kiwi saturated fat?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was the typical Kiwi. We didn't have a huge breakdown, but we did, I think, at one point look at just the polys, the monos, and the saturates. Yeah. Mm. So, it really wasn't particularly remarkable, other than being a Kiwi style fat.
Sure. Yeah. Any thoughts on how to convince GPs to think about BMI of 30 in a healthier elder person?
Yeah, I think it's got a lot to do with education, because I know there's a lot of older people who are they're worried about being overweight. They think it's going to affect their heart health, and they're trying to lose weight. So I think we've really got to just encourage people to keep active and keep eating. I I'm not sure. I'm really not sure at GP level what happens there. But I think a BMI under 23 is certainly well known in the sort of nutrition gerontology world as being a bit of a risk factor. That, you know, there's nothing wrong with people having a BMI in the 25 to 30 range at all. And for some people, you know, 30 might be quite appropriate, particularly if they're a larger person and that they're active.
Thinking about, of course, we want to promote real food for people to eat, but is there a quick fix? Is there a supplement or something that can be bought from the supermarket, such as something as simple as Complan, that would actually make a difference?
I think it's to do with how acceptable it is, but I think we've got to think about the breakfast meal and the lunch meal a bit more, and, you know, trying to think about the food groups and thinking about things like, I know a lot of older people are too scared to eat eggs because they think they're going to have a lot of cholesterol and they're worried about their heart health. So, you know, we've got to get over some of those kind of things, but also I think it's difficult if people miss their breakfast meal, you know, when you're older, because it means you lose that opportunity to eat, you know, those calories and nutrients as well. Yeah, and just thinking about, you know, what the seasonal foods are, you know, and what can be easy for older people to actually prepare and eat. But I think it's a great idea if people enjoy adding Complan to milk or whatever, then that's great. That's great. And, you know, I think there are a lot of obviously very sophisticated supplements available, which are used a lot in hospitals and age residential care. But I think in the community, we want to keep to whole food as much as possible. But even just having enough milk during the day would be a big help.
And so should we be advocating for a lower fat, higher calcium milk?
I think it really depends. If I think somebody is tending to be on the lower end of the BMI scale, they're probably better to have, you know, the light blue or blue milk, depending on their situation, and just having enough of it, you know, and be great if more dairy products were included, because the calcium intakes of these advanced aged older people are just too low to sustain good bone health.
So adding an egg at breakfast, adding some more dairy products, adding some more legumes, what are some of the other suggestions that could be added to different meals throughout the day to increase protein particularly?
Well, I think it's about thinking about things like having sardines on toast, or when they're in season, avocados are, you know, really good food. Yeah, just keeping to what really is available and affordable, but something that older people will enjoy, and having a variety of foods is important.
Right. What about increasing calcium intake for people that are lactose intolerant? Also, another question here related to a similar thing about a number of people choosing to be dairy free. How do they get adequate calcium?
Yeah, well, I don't know whether there are a lot of people who choose to be dairy free in the octogenarian age group, but I think that is really important if they choose to not have dairy, to have a calcium fortified soy milk or similar. Really, really important to have a substitute.
Somebody here just checking, they're saying that they promote yellow top milk, which is higher in calcium. Should they be changing their views on that?
Well, no, I think yellow top milk's great, and it's really only for people who are really on the lower end of the BMI scale and need to gain weight that I think about the higher fat milks. But, you know, by the time you get into your 80s and 90s, I think the need for calories and nutrients is more important than being too concerned about the fat intake, although it is desirable, of course, probably to have yellow top milk, throughout life, because you're having more calcium, relatively speaking, and therefore you can get good fats from other foods. But we've got to think about people's weight. We don't want them to lose weight. We want them to maintain a really good weight, so that they're not using their muscle as an energy source at any stage.
There's a useful comment here from Helen Gibbs, and she's suggesting to some of the people that she sees to use whey protein in their breakfast.
Yeah, well, if people like it and it's practical for them to use, then that's great. And that is going to give the kind of, amino acids that are going to be beneficial for protein anabolism for sure. But I don't really know how many people do that. But yeah, or even adding skim milk powder to milk to make it more nutrient dense. I think anything that's acceptable, but the nutrition community needs to be working with people to make sure that they can provide solutions that are tailored to their needs.
I guess a lot of this population too has been brought up in the cardiovascular era, where they've been taught low fat, and they've carried that through without perhaps changing the message.
Yeah. And I think that's where the eggs come in too, Alison, that people are afraid to eat eggs.
What about probiotics, taking a supplement for probiotics?
Well, I don't know. I think we have the Yakult, which is a very efficient way of getting really good quality probiotics, and we also have Symbio in New Zealand, which is the dairy industry of New Zealand probiotic. But I think just the whole notion of encouraging people to use supplements is fraught with difficulty when people might not be able to afford it, but it really depends on how accessible these kinds of supplements are to people.
The screening that you mentioned, is there a screening tool for Indigenous peoples?
Not in particular, but we know that tools like the mini nutrition assessment seems to work across all ethnic groups. But in the community, we've always used the screen tool because it asks about the four food groups. It asks if you have difficulty doing your grocery shopping, whether you have difficulty preparing meals. So it's very much in tune with the needs of community living older people.
Carol, I think there's a number of takeout messages. One of mine is that oral health is particularly important, and people looking after their teeth or getting dentures is vital to ensure that people actually can chew and eat food. Having perhaps smaller but higher nutritious meals with the protein spread much more evenly throughout the day, especially adding some extra protein at breakfast time in there as well. Increasing fruits and vegetables. But lastly, I think the biggest take-home message for me is to encourage people to be eating socially and eating with other people. Is there another key message that I've missed?
I think you've got it in a nutshell, really, Alison. Yeah. And I think that we can't overestimate the companionship that facilitates eating. And you often hear about people, bringing their older parent home, and where they eat like a horse, and yet at home that they're not eating much at all. So just providing that opportunity is great, and that's why Senior Chef has worked so well in Canterbury. It's a cooking program where people actually go and cook and eat a meal with others, and the Just Cook program that the Nutrition Foundation have rolled out is equally, you know, really effective. So the more that kind of thing we can do, the better, I think.
On that note, let's leave it today. Thank you so much, Carol. That's a fabulous overview about nutrition for our older population. I really thank you for the preparation and time that you've put in and the very practical messages that you've left us with today. Thank you to our listeners for listening in, and we look forward to welcoming you back again next week. This webinar will be on the ANA website in about a week's time. So ka kite anō.
Thanks so much.